Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Once again, I am your instructor, Vernon Creviston, and in today's lecture, we're going to kind of pick up where we left off in the last couple, explaining kind of this interaction between East and West. As Europeans move west and they run into Native Americans, what kind of happens, and how do these Europeans start establishing themselves in the Western Hemisphere and start kind of exploiting the resources that they find there. So that's kind of what's on tap in this particular lecture today, is talking about how these Europeans establish empires in the Western Hemisphere. We already kind of started talking about that in our last lecture where we talked about the Spanish in that period of first contact as Europeans are just trying to figure out what's here in the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish being first, were able to take out over huge parts of Western Hemisphere and exploit a lot of the resources and wealth that they found there, which totally transformed Spain. So what we're going to do is kind of follow along in that theme. We're going to take a look at some of the important European nations that took part in this expansion, this European establishment of empires, and then some of the impact that those empires had on their home countries, and of course, just the rivalries that came from all of that. And that's going to be an important part to understanding why the United States exists the way it does today. All right, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and kind of do a little bit of a recap here. Please do remember that when Columbus and other early European explorers started coming over, they weren't sure what they really ran into. They did understand pretty quickly that this is someplace new. It wasn't Asia, it wasn't Japan or India or China that they'd run into. It was something totally different. Only Columbus really held on to the belief that he had found Asia at his death in 1506. Most other explorers all understood this is something new. We need to figure out what this is. And what you'll notice is there's all kinds of different explorers. The English send explorers like Henry Cabot. The French send people like Cartier and La Salle and others. The Spanish, of course, not only have Columbus, they have De Soto, Coronado, Cortez, Portola, a whole host of people, Pizarro, right? So the Spanish are quite active in this period, but so are a lot of other Europeans. There are Frenchmen, there are Englishmen, there are Swedes, there's all kinds of different groups of people establishing kind of contact with the New World, if you will. But what we're going to look at first, of course, is the Spanish, kind of a recap of where we were in our last lecture. So kind of as a reminder, please do keep in mind that the Spanish, for the most part, create their empire through conquest. Very rarely do they actually work with the natives and hold them as equals. For the most part, the Spanish come in and take over a territory, usually with military force, sometimes with economic force. Now, again, we have to kind of remember, how are they actually able to do this? How can a few hundred Spanish soldiers take over the Aztec Empire? It's a huge empire with millions of people. Well, the simple answer is they use native rivalries to help them. They tell one group of natives, hey, we'll help you against this other group. They do work together to defeat that other native tribe. And then the Spanish turn on their allies and they'll control them, to kill their leadership off, force them to accept Spanish rule, whatever it might be. Usually aided by these diseases that are completely transforming this relationship. I mean, ostensibly, the Spanish should have a very difficult time taking over the New World to the extent they do. But because these diseases come in and upend native society, sometimes just decimate whole communities to the tune of 90% of the people dying within a few years before a Spanish soldier or colonist ever shows up, it really kind of makes it easier for the Spanish to kind of pull these things off. And of course, once they do take over, they enslave the natives that are left, force them to do work for them, help them build up their wealth and control of the system, what's known as the encomienda system, a system that they brought with them from Spain, the Spanish conquistadores did. And because of all this, it does create a thing called the Black Legend. These stories of the Spanish coming in and just being horrific to the native peoples in an attempt to subdue them and tell them, hey, you're no longer in charge. We're the ones that have to be listened to now. We rule this place and we rule you. Again, like I mentioned last time, it's actually a Spanish priest, a Catholic priest by the name of De las Casas. He originally came over as one of those soldiers looking to get rich, looking to get land, become an important person. That's what's spurring a lot of this Spanish exploration and conquest. But he decides to become a missionary. He joins the Catholic Church, becomes a Spanish Catholic priest, and starts trying to go out to the natives and convince them to become Christians, become Catholics like him. But when he goes out there amongst the natives, he finds that they're terribly afraid of him, that they don't want anything to do with the Spanish, which makes sense considering the Spanish are bringing diseases that are wiping them out. And of course, the Spanish are literally wiping them out through military force sometimes. But De las Casas does show us that the Spanish don't always act in this manner. He writes a series of letters back to Spain, especially to the king and queen in the early 1500s, where he explains, hey, look, we're the bad guys here. The Spanish soldiers are going out. They're being incredibly violent. They're destroying native villages. They're taking bets on how they're going to kill people. They're killing men, women, children. Doesn't matter. They're just wiping people out. And De las Casas contrasts this behavior on the Spanish with the behavior of the natives, who he says are for the most part pretty peace loving. They don't fight much. They don't have the kind of weapons that can even allow them to really be a threat to us. So De las Casas asks, why are we doing this? Why are we being so horrific to these people when they could be just part of our community? Why don't we treat them like people? So that is a big step forward here, right? Does show us another side of things, if you will. And it is also kind of ironic, the thing that comes out of De las Casas's letters. He describes Spanish soldiers as wolves and lions among the sheep, right? He's trying to point out that it's really the Spanish that are the awful people here. And what he's trying to point out is that is absolutely counter to what Christians call themselves, the way they're supposed to act. He says in his letters, look, it's the natives who are acting more Christian than we are. That needs to stop. And in the end, De las Casas's letters actually kind of work. Not completely, but somewhat. The encomienda system is kind of transformed a little bit. The natives still have to do work for the Spanish colonists or for the controlling population, but they are allowed at least some of their own lands and to kind of do things their own. They still have to become Christians. They still have to dress and act Spanish, speak Spanish, but they have more autonomy than they did before. So in some ways, De las Casas is pointing forward that there is a way to kind of merge these two groups. Maybe not an equal footing, but that in the end, they are people, and the Spanish need to treat them like people. Proof of that comes from the fact that a lot of Spanish soldiers, a lot of Spanish colonists are men. Very few women are coming from Spain to kind of take part in this colonization process. So if you're a man and you want to pass on what you're building here in the New World to your children, you're going to have to marry native women, and they do. So there is kind of an intermingling here. The natives are a part of this Spanish community that's being created. It's just totally on Spanish terms, if you will. Natives are going to resist. There are going to be rebellions against the Spanish all the way into the 1800s. But for the most part, the Spanish put all of those down. They stay firmly in control of this empire they're building. Also, one of the things we have to kind of remember is even though De las Casas is trying to understand that natives are people and get the Spanish colonists especially to treat natives like people, it doesn't stop this process of wiping out native culture. Whether it be De las Casas or Junipero Serra, they're going to go out there and tell natives the way you're living your life is wrong. You need to dress like us, speak like us, pray like us. You need to be us for all intents and purposes. Native culture, wherever it exists, wherever the Spanish run into it, they wipe it out. Destroy religious artifacts, destroy religious sites. They don't care. The Spanish are going to force the natives to start adopting their European customs. Maybe the starkest way to point this out is to show you a couple of pictures. This is an artist's conceptual rendering, right? Just kind of a conceptual drawing of what Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, probably would have looked like right before Cortez and the Spanish army that was with him showed up. And what you see here is a huge central plaza filled with administrative and religious buildings, right? The emperor's palace is there and kind of in the center. The temples to the moon and the sun are on the left-hand side here. So important religious and administrative buildings are in this plaza where tens of thousands of people would come together to practice religious ceremonies or important state ceremonies. What we see is a thriving city surrounded by homes and farming areas that help support this great city of maybe 250,000 people by the time Cortez shows up. Maybe had 1 million people at its height. We don't know. But it is incredibly successful. It's one thing we have to understand. And of course, they are civilized. The Aztecs are doing everything. Native Americans everywhere are doing everything that is required to be considered civilized. Yet when the Spanish show up, they literally wipe all of this out. This is a picture of today's Mexico City, and it is the exact same place that was shown in that artist drawing, that artist rendering. That is the same spot. Those buildings that the Aztec built, well, they're still sort of there. They've just been refashioned into Spanish churches, Catholic churches, cathedrals, Spanish administrative buildings. What used to be the emperor's palace gets turned into Cortez's governor's palace, right? What used to be the temple of the moon and the temple of the sun gets turned into a Catholic cathedral. The square is still there where tens of thousands of people can still meet and come together to this day. So in some ways you can kind of see this process that's taking place here. Colonization is just this. A group of people from the outside come in and they bring their world with them. The way they do things gets transposed in this new place. And Native Americans are kind of getting wiped out in the process. Spain is growing, but Native American culture is being wiped out and literally paved over in some cases, as is this. But what we do see is something that is remarkable. This country of Spain that was barely able to be on its feet had fought a 600-long-year war to get their country back from what they called invaders, has become one of the largest empires in the world by the late 17th century. They have colonies throughout South America, Central America, and even into North America. Most of the Caribbean is under their control. Now, of course, other Europeans are starting to kind of push in on this. It is difficult for Spain to protect everything, including doing the things they want to do in Europe. So they're stressed here, right? They're stretched pretty thin, and Europeans are taking advantage of that, picking off some of the islands in the Caribbean, establishing their own colonies in North America and South America. But the Spanish definitely have the largest chunk of real estate out of all the Europeans, and it has transformed their country. They are now one of the most powerful, one of the most wealthy countries in Europe by the late 1600s. Other countries want to follow that lead and do the same thing. So that's what we're going to turn our attention to here, is some of these other European countries. And of course, the one we're going to start with is the French, because odds are that if we had been back there in that period in the late 15th, early 16th centuries, we probably would have guessed it to be the French that would have been the ones to put together this massive empire. They're a wealthier country, they're a bigger country, they have a bigger population than Spain. They have everything they need to pull this off. And yet they're going to be a little late to this. They're going to be decades behind the Spanish. So we're going to kind of take a look at how the French pull off building their empire, and if they kind of follow the same route, the same plan as the Spanish do. Again, kind of keep in mind, the Spanish kind of create a template. This is how you can do it, right? Columbus kind of laid that out in some of his letters to the Spanish king and queen, saying, I think you can really take these places over. I think this place, this new world has a lot to offer, and you're going to want to take control of it. So are the French going to follow that Spanish model, or are they going to do something different? And we'll kind of do the same thing with the Dutch and the English empires, to see what their origins are. How do they compare to the Spanish? Are they going to be the same, or are they going to be different? What we're going to find out with the French is actually they're going to be a little different, because even though they have maybe a lot of the resources that you would think are very important to making an empire possible, they also have some problems. One of which is most French people don't want to leave France. It's a big country. They have a lot of what they need there already. The French monarchy is constantly embroiled in wars in Europe of a religious or political nature. So most of their military is needed there in Europe to protect their country, their territories that they're claiming. They don't have a lot of resources to put into building an empire in the New World. But there are going to be French explorers coming over, especially people like La Salle, who uses the rivers of interior North America to kind of explore and claim territory for France, using the St. Lawrence in the kind of the upper seaboard of what is today the United States and Canada, through to the Great Lakes region along the Ohio River, and then down into the Mississippi River. The French start exploring this, seeing what's available to them. At first, they are looking for another Aztec or another Inca empire to conquer and get rich from, but they quickly find out that that's not going to happen. There aren't any gold deposits right around there. The natives don't live in concentrated, wealthy empires like the Aztecs or the Incas, where the population's all in one place and they have a lot of their wealth concentrated in one place. These natives, like the Iroquois we talked about a couple lectures ago, live kind of spread out in small groups across a wide area of land. They're pretty protective of that land because it means their survival. They literally depend on that territory, so they're pretty protective of it. So when the French come in here, they find that they need to kind of do things differently. They're not just going to be able to send in an army and just kind of take over. These natives are a little bit more organized up in this area in some ways. There's less conquest between the different tribes, although the tribes may not always get along. They don't go to war with each other and conquer each other like the Aztecs were going around taking over all their neighbors, making their neighbors enemies. It's not as prevalent up in this region. So when the French show up, they have to kind of adapt to a new reality. There's very few of them, French colonists coming over in the first place. So they need to kind of find a way to coexist with the natives. And in the northern part of their empire, what they're going to call New France, they do something the Spanish never really do. They ask permission of the natives to get some land and settle there and start having their homes. And eventually, the communities of Quebec and Montreal, some of the first French settlements in the New World, are established there. And they trade with the natives. They actually buy the land and respect the natives' area. They say, okay, you guys live over there, we live over here. We'll do what we want here, you do what you want there. They need to do that because there's so few French colonists that they could get wiped out by these powerful native tribes like the Iroquois or the Huron at any given moment. So in the northern part of their empire, around what is today the Quebec province in Canada, along the St. Lawrence River, the French actually do something different. They build a few cities, they have a lot of little farms around those cities, and they live pretty peacefully with the native neighbors without really trying to take them over and forcing them to do anything. They just say, we would like some of this land to live on. In the middle part of their empire, the French do something even more different. There are almost no French people that are going to go to live on a permanent basis. Mostly what they do is establish forts to protect these important trade routes and these communication lines through this French empire. And of course, they send tradesmen, fur trappers for the most part. One of the things the French do find that's very valuable in this area are furs. Furs are needed in Europe for warm winter clothing. Most of Europe has hunted out their domestic stock of fur-bearing animals, so it is great to have this resource available. Who's the best at going out and getting those animals and collecting their furs, their pelts? It's the natives, of course. So French traders move into this area, trading with these different groups of natives, but on an equal basis. They're kind of form a commercial partnership, if you will. In the southern part of this empire, the French do things a little differently. There, because the climate's warmer and there's more water available, the French are going to try to do something different. They establish a city that's called New Orleans that is still there to this day. It's one of the oldest cities in the United States. And it begins as kind of a base of operations for some French colonists to start what we will know as the plantation system. They're going to establish farms here but they're not going to do like what they're doing in the northern part of New France, where they're growing mostly grains, things like corn, wheat, barley, things that you'll use to feed yourself, to make breads and products. No, the French are going to do something different in New Orleans because it's warmer and wetter, has a longer growing season than Canada does. They're going to try and grow sugarcane. Sugar is one of the most profitable commodities of the 17th and 18th centuries. It makes you a lot of money. And because Spain controls so much of the Caribbean, well, anywhere you can grow it is a big money maker. So the French establish New Orleans. They start establishing plantations, giant farms along the outskirts of that city, and start trying to grow sugarcane. At first, they do conquer some of the native tribes in the area. They're not going to work with them like they did up in the northern part of their colony because they need the labor. They need somebody to go and work in the sugarcane fields. But they find that it's hard to keep the natives on these plantations. The natives can get away and find refuge outside the control of the French government or French colonists. They also find that most of the natives that are enslaved really don't know how to grow sugarcane. Sugarcane's not indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. It comes from Africa. So like the Spanish, the French are going to jump into using enslaved Africans as a labor force. The Spanish did it to grow sugarcane in the Caribbean, but then to start working the gold and silver mines of the Aztecs and the Inca. Usually the Spanish would use enslaved native labor, but as that became harder and as they became more and more intermarried, that made less and less sense. So the Spanish turned more and more to enslaved Africans. Well, now, since that transportation of enslaved Africans has already started from Africa to the New World, the French jump in and start using enslaved Africans in their colony of New France, especially around New Orleans. So what we kind of see here is kind of a grab bag of things. For the most part, however, the French are going to be very different than the Spanish. They may follow the Spanish in using enslaved Africans as their labor force in some places, but for the most part, the Spanish don't do what the French don't do what the Spanish did. They actually treat natives more as equals. They work with them. Now, in some areas, they are a little bit more like the Spanish. When the French establish cities like Quebec and Montreal, they do bring France with them. To this day, if you go to Montreal, Montreal is the second largest city in the world that speaks French. I mean, think about that. A city in Canada has more French-speaking people than every city in France other than Paris. So the French do make their presence felt, right? Up here in the northern part of their empire, they establish a very French-feeling, French-speaking colony, because they're separate from the natives. They don't see the natives necessarily as enemies to be conquered, but also the natives aren't brought in. But in the other parts of their colonies, because the French colonists just aren't coming over in big numbers, there's only about 3,000 French people in this New France in the mid-1660s. By the early 1700s, it's only gone up to about 25,000, and it's a huge amount of territory we're talking about. So how do you keep control of this? How do you protect this empire when you have so few troops? What keeps the Spanish, what keeps the English or the Dutch from coming in and taking all of this from the French? Well, it's their relations with the natives. And this is going to have an important impact on how things play out for the creation of the United States. A lot of these French colonists that come over, like the Spanish, are mostly men. And when they get here, if they're a fur trader or even a farmer in northern New France, they need somebody to marry to pass on everything to. So often native women will end up marrying French men. But again, they'll be kind of, if they're in places like Quebec and Montreal, the women will be expected to speak French, act, dress like they're French, and kind of behave in a French manner. But it's very different in other parts of the empire, especially in the middle part around the Great Lakes. There, the French dress like the natives. There, the French act like the natives and learn to speak native languages. They follow their customs instead of making the natives follow French customs. So that's kind of an amazing thing. And because the French show a little bit of respect, because the French don't come in and try to conquer, they actually make allies a of a lot of the native tribes that are in their territory. Because after all, a lot of these natives are competing with other native tribes. The French are so few, they don't really see them as a threat. Who's the threat? The neighboring tribe that wants to take your land, that wants your resources. Another thing that the French do that's different, besides kind of respecting native culture, is they do send missionaries. There are Catholic French missionaries coming, just like there are Catholic Spanish missionaries in the Spanish Empire. But those French missionaries, when they show up, they don't say, okay, we're going to wipe out your religious practices. Now you have to act French and become Christians. They tried to actually convert them, much like what De las Casas was asking the Spanish to do. They understand, they listen to how the natives portray their customs, their religious aspects, and then they try to say why the natives should become Christians. Not forcing them to, but getting them to adopt those customs. So in a lot of ways, the French are much more ingratiating. The French are much more respectful of natives than the Spanish ever had been, because they have to be. There just aren't enough French soldiers, French colonists to really go in and take over on a massive scale. They can kind of do that in the northern reaches in what is today Quebec province of Canada, but that's about the only place where the French can really dominate things. And even then, they really still rely on the natives for peace in the area. It's the natives that are going to fight alongside the French for more than 150 years and help protect this empire, because the French actually are good partners for a lot of these natives. So it is kind of interesting to see that from the very beginning, these Europeans aren't going to do things the same ways. There's going to be a lot of give and take here. Realities on the ground are going to influence how these different groups create these empires. So the next one we want to take a look at is the Dutch. Again, they're going to have an important part in kind of helping create the United States. We want to see how they play into it. And also we want to note just which one of these possible models do they follow. Do they follow the Spanish model of conquering and just taking over and subjugating natives? Or are they kind of more with the French, work with the natives when you need to, work with the natives to help protect this empire? So to explain what's going on with the Dutch, we're going to start with somebody else first. And we're going to look at a group called the Swedes. It's another European country that wants to, build an empire. It's already trying to do that in Europe. Sweden at the time in the 17th century is a powerful military country. It's a small country. It has a small population, but they have a very well-trained army and they have good leaders, and they are really starting to expand in Northern Europe, especially in what we call the Nordic countries like Norway, Finland, and even parts of Russia. Well, to help fuel this war machine, to help fuel the finances needed to keep their military operating, the Swedes decide in the early 1600s to establish their own colony in the New World. After all, it's worked wonders for the Spanish. Now the French are getting into it. Why shouldn't they? But they do have a very small population. So they're not able to send over more than a couple of hundred people in the first years of their colony. But they still establish it in what is today kind of northern Delaware, eastern Pennsylvania, maybe even parts of New Jersey. The Dutch establish a place called Fort Christiana, or Fort Christina. It is a trading post for the most part, but it is kind of a community where these Swedes live, and for the most part, they're farmers in the area. They actually do work with the natives, again, kind of like with the French. They're not going to be enough of them to really go out and conquer the natives. They're going to need to work along with the natives. So they establish their little trading post and work with the natives to gain that land. But as they start farming, they find out something. There is a resource, like what the French are doing, that is very valuable, that can help fuel this empire, and that, of course, is the fur trade. Problem for the Swedes is, as they move into the fur trade, start trading with the native peoples in the region for those animal furs, they're actually becoming a commercial threat to one of their neighboring empires, the Dutch Empire. One of the Dutch governors in the 1650s decides, we need to stop this now before this becomes a big threat to our commercial operations. He sends a small army over from the Dutch colony of New Netherlands and crushes this Swedish colony. That's really the important part of this story, right? Of this part of the story. What you have to kind of keep in mind is they don't know these things are going to work when they establish these colonies. They don't know if they're going to survive. There's a lot of things that could go against these colonies. Rivalries between other Europeans is a big reason why they're not always going to be successful. Fort Christina, the Swedish colony, isn't the only one that's wiped out by fellow Europeans. St. Augustine, one of the oldest cities in the United States next to New Orleans, it originally started as a colony of French Protestants. French Protestants were essentially kicked out of France, which stayed a Catholic country during these religious wars of the Reformation. They fled kind of to the New World to find a place where they could practice their religion freely. Some of them, about 80 or so, 100 or so, established this place called St. Augustine on the eastern coast of Florida. The Spanish saw it as a threat to their claims in the area and went in and killed everybody, men, women, and children. So these colonies are not guaranteed to be successes, right? What's happened for the Spanish is pretty rare if you stop and think about it, right? They've been wildly successful. And now the French are seeing some modest success. And the Dutch are not going to allow the Swedes to do that on their turf, so to speak. And that's who we really want to take a look at here is the Dutch, because they are going to do things a little differently in their colony. They're going to kind of combine a little bit of the elements of the French Empire in the New World and the Spanish Empire. Where they can, they'll defeat and control the natives. Where they can't, they'll work with them, especially if it means they get access to the goods they want, especially animal furs. And what we need to understand here is Netherlands, what we today call the Dutch, Holland, right? A lot of different names for this particular territory. It is a tiny little country in northwestern Europe. It's north of France. It's west of Germany, or what will become Germany. And it has been fighting for its existence for a long time now. For hundreds of years, it's been dominated by its neighbors, whether it be the French, whether it be the Spanish. Well, here in the early or in the late 1500s, they've finally gotten their independence. But they have a tiny population, just a few hundred thousands of people. And yet they're going to put together a huge commercial empire. They saw what having an empire did for the Spanish, and they say, hey, we need to do that so we have enough money to protect our interests. So they start establishing colonies everywhere. In parts of Asia and the Far East, they create trading conglomerates. They have small outposts and trade with the peoples in that area. Africa, they start getting into the slave trade because that's lucrative, makes them money. They control parts of Africa to protect that trade. They start moving into the New World, especially South America and the Caribbean, so they can start getting into the sugar trade as well. And then, of course, they turn their attention to North America. There they establish a small trading post, ostensibly so they can start getting access to these animal furs that are going to be useful in Europe. And they establish their New Netherlands, a new part of their empire in what is today New York, where New York City is. So when they show up, one of the things we have to kind of keep in mind is the Dutch are going to have to be a little different than anybody else. They have a lot fewer people. They're commercially oriented, more than kind of mining or farming or anything like that. Now, don't get me wrong; there will be Dutch farmers. There'll be all kinds of different people in this little Dutch empire. But for the most part, they've got to figure out a way to make this successful. And they don't want any competition more than they have to deal with. They know they can't defeat France, but they're far enough away that that won't be an issue. But when the Swedes, a smaller, less powerful country, comes in, they feel like, hey, we need to remove that threat. So the Dutch can be pretty aggressive. And as they settle in their territory, essentially from what is today Long Island and New York, all the way up of the Hudson River Valley to what they called Fort Orange, what is today Albany, New York, the capital of New York State, they've got to find a way to make all of this work. Most of the Dutch settlers are going to live here in what they call New Amsterdam, what will eventually become New York. A few more are in the area that they Brookline, what we call Brooklyn today on Long Island, just across from Manhattan Island in New York City. And then a few people are going to be up in the northern regions, what is today Fort Orange. or what is today Albany. Fort Orange was its Dutch name. And what's you're going to see is they're going to combine both the French mode of operating and the Spanish mode within this one colony. Down around New Amsterdam, where the Dutch feel we have enough people, we don't really need the natives, there they go out and conquer them. They force them out. Sometimes they do trade with them, but then they quickly kind of turn their back on any agreements because it's beneficial to them to get more territory, to push the natives farther away. They're not going to bring the natives in, even like the Spanish, as conquered members of their community. They're forcing the natives out completely. In the northern part of their colony, around Fort Orange, it's very different. There, they work with the natives. They invite them in, have them live there, trade with them there. They respect the natives because up there, you're dealing with the powerful Iroquois people. They could wipe this trading post out anytime they wanted to, and the Dutch realized that. So where they have to, the French or the Dutch are respectful like the French. Where they can be, they're conquerors like the Spanish. And again, they could be just as devastating in some ways. One of their wars they have is called the Dutch Indian War, the 1640s. They go out and the Dutch just absolutely slaughter everybody they come in contact with around the regions of New Amsterdam, around what is today New York. They kill men, women, children, they don't care. So in that way, they do sound a lot like the Spanish. It's easier to just wipe the natives out and take their lands because then they're not a threat to you. But up in Fort Orange, what is today Albany, there they work with them. And what we kind of see is the Dutch, because of the lack of population, because of these rivalries with other European nations, they know that they have issues, that this can all be taken away from them. So they decide to open their colony up to a lot of other groups of people. Up to this point, these colonies, these empires that are being built, are limited to just the people from their home countries. New France is filled of French people. The Spanish New Spain is full of Spanish colonists. They're not asking people from other places. But what makes the Dutch colony unique is they're actually going to open up their settlement of New Amsterdam, and especially the New Netherlands, to almost anybody that wants to come over. The Dutch hope that their ideals of having personal liberty, that you have some individual rights, that there should be a free press, that people should be able to speak their minds to their neighbors, that kind of thing, will draw people in. That's kind of how the Dutch and the English have very similar concepts in that way. And they're going to apply those rules, those laws, to their actual colonies. And they're going to allow Europeans from anywhere. If you're a French Huguenot, that's a French Protestant, and you need a place to live, come to our colony. In 1655, when the Dutch take over New Sweden, there's only 2,000 people living in the Dutch colony of the New Netherlands. They know that this thing is fragile. But they open up to Quakers. That is a type of English Protestant. They open themselves up to Jews. Some of the first synagogues in the Western Hemisphere are in the Dutch colony. Synagogues are a Jewish type of religious temple. So suddenly, the Dutch are bringing in people from all over, primarily from England, a few French, and then some Jews from scattered across Europe. But by 1664, they've been able to quadruple their population, both by Dutch people coming over and by these Europeans moving in. All they ask is that you follow Dutch laws, follow Dutch customs, but for the most part, do whatever you want religiously, do whatever you want economically, as long as you trade within the Dutch Empire. They even, to kind of entice people to come to this colony, give women legal rights that you would not find in most of the rest of Europe. The Dutch found it just made things smoother, made their economic system work better if women had certain legal rights, especially when it came to inheritance. So a lot of women from other countries, other neighboring colonies, would actually come to the Dutch colony because they found they had more rights, they had more opportunities there than they would in any different place. One woman in particular, Anne Hutchinson, she's a Puritan that goes to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and is exiled from it. She decides, where am I going to find true religious freedom? I'll find it in actually the Dutch colony of New Netherlands. There, they'll let me pray the way I want to, hold religious services the way I want to. So, in a lot of ways, the Dutch are pretty open in their society. And to show you just how lenient they can be compared to other Europeans, still not what we would today call lenient by any stretch of the imagination. But they do give what is called kind of a half freedom to enslaved African peoples. They are in the slave trade. They're using slave labor on their farms, in their commerce as well. They're making a lot of money trading and selling slaves in the New World from Africa. And they're also using, as they gain islands in the Caribbean, they're using slave labor to grow sugarcane there as well, just like other Europeans are. But here in the New Netherlands, to keep things kind of quiet, to make sure that they don't have the problems in this colony that are starting to pop up in the Caribbean and other parts of the European empires in the New World with slave rebellions, they give slaves what is they called termed half freedom. That slaves could actually have their own homes separate from their owners. They could keep some of their pay if they negotiated that with their owners. So if they did work and were paid, their owner didn't get all of that money. Some of it had to go to the enslaved person themselves so they could eventually buy their freedom. And it kind of worked, right? There were very few slave rebellions in the New Netherlands. What is, New Amsterdam, the New York City today? It was very cosmopolitan, lots of different people, lots of different languages being spoke. But at the same time, it was very European, if you will. You could see kind of the Dutch influence there. It looked like a little bit of Europe being transplanted to the Western Hemisphere. So what you kind of see here in the Dutch colony is this combination of things, right? At one point, they are kind of like the Spanish, taking over and pushing natives out. At other times, they're very inclusive, bringing other people from Europe in, which nobody else is doing, and working with the natives, especially in the northern part of their empire, the northern part of their colony, where they need to trade with the natives to help stimulate their economy. Now, the next one we're going to turn to is, of course, the one that matters the most when you're talking about American history, and that is the English. And what is the most surprising here is how late in the game the English are compared to the Spanish, the French, and even the Dutch. All three of those powers have established colonies in the New World, and the English haven't even gotten started yet. So we need to kind of explain why it takes England to get so long to get into this, and also kind of keep in mind that if they're the last ones of the major European countries to show up here in the New World, what's going to be left for them, right? All the other good spots are probably claimed already. What is going to be left over for the English to claim for themselves? Not much, as it turns out, comparatively speaking, in scale. So the first attempt at an English colony we want to talk about here is a thing called Roanoke Colony, or the Virginia Colony, as it unofficially was known at the time. This concept is started in 1585 when a rich nobleman by the name of Sir Walter Raleigh, that's how you actually pronounce his name. I know we all say Raleigh, but it's Raleigh is actually how you pronounce his name. The English do not know how to pronounce their own language, right? We've got to keep that in mind. But Sir Walter Raleigh is a nobleman, and he's very close personal friends with the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth I. They were even kind of lovers at one point, but that's kind of cooled off, and he's just a friend at this point. But he decides in the 1580s that, like a lot of English people have decided, is they need to get into this empire game. It's done wonders for Spain. It looks like the French are going to do it. It looks like the Dutch are going to do it. England needs its own colonies. Now, it's true, England actually is colonizing parts of the world, but it's mostly in their area. The island of Ireland is being taken over by the English at this time. That's where most of England's focus is. But Raleigh and others say, look, there's a lot of resources out there in the Western Hemisphere, in this new world. Why don't we get that? Look at how rich the Spanish are getting. And some English sailors, captains of ships, people like Drake and Hawkins, they're out there attacking Spanish ships, finding fabulous amount of wealth. People like Raleigh say, why do we have to fight a war to get money from the Spanish? Let's just go and get it from the source itself, like the Spanish did. conquer our own Aztecs or Inca. So all through 1585, 1586, Raleigh puts together a group of investors. This is going to be a commercial operation. He knows that the English government, the English Queen, Elizabeth I, doesn't have the money or resources to actually create an English colony. So he's going to fund it. What they're going to hope to do is find gold like the Spanish, and that'll pay for everything. If they don't, at least they'll have a base of operations where some of their ships can use to get food, get supplies, and go out attack Spanish ships and get gold that way. So to Raleigh, this makes perfect sense. This is kind of a no-lose situation. When he presents it to the Queen, she kind of sees it for what it is. Raleigh and his investors need the Queen's permission. They're going to be doing this for England. They are English and they need their Queen's permission to do this. But they really aren't putting any risk on her shoulders. They're going to pay for it, they're going to run it, and then she'll get a percentage of the profits, so to speak. So in the end, the English Queen gives her blessings to Raleigh and his investors, and they put together a small little fleet of about 4 or 5 ships to sail over and establish a colony that they'll call Virginia in honor of their queen. In total, about 117 people are put together in this first effort to colonize by the English. They bring men, women, and children. As a matter of fact, one of the first English children born in North America is going to be from this particular expedition. Her name is called Virginia Dare. So these settlers, these English colonists, start coming over in 1587. Most of these people that are involved in this colonial effort aren't rich nobles like Raleigh. He's going to stay home in England. He's just one of the people running the operation, funding the operation. He's going to leave it to others to actually go out and do the things they want to do. Most of the people they send over are just average English subjects, right? The people that live in England. They may be brick makers, they may be rope makers, bakers, farmers. Very few of them have ever established a colony or know what it's like to survive in the wilderness, right? In a world that has nothing that you're used to. So you can see this is not going to go well, right? It's got a lot of challenges from the very beginning. What makes it even more challenging is that relations between Spain and England collapse here in the late 1580s. The Spanish are tired of English ships attacking them, stealing their gold, and then of course they see the creation of this colony as a danger, as a way for the English to start moving in and taking over parts of the Spanish Empire. So in 1588, just months after this new colony is established in Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina, England and Spain go to war. Now, in the meantime, this little colony has unloaded its 110 people or so, and they've begun to try and establish themselves on an island off the coast of North Carolina. They've even met with the natives that live in the region and asked where can they live that won't cause problems. So the English do kind of start trying to negotiate with the natives and try to kind of respect at least a little bit native controls, because they have to. Like the Spanish and like the Dutch, they need the natives to leave them alone because there's so few of them and they're going to be so weak at the beginning. They know that they're just not going to be able to withstand attacks by the natives because they already have to worry about other Europeans. The last thing you want is the Spanish to come by, give a bunch of weapons to the natives and tell them to go wipe those people out. So the English are pretty deferential here in this period. They live on an island the natives say that they could live on, this place called Roanoke Island, which we've named after the right island, but we're not entirely sure where this place was, honestly. But in the end, what they find out when they start living there is there's a reason the natives gave it to them. It is not prime real estate. If it was, the natives would have kept it. There's not a lot of great water. There's very little game, food to grow or to hunt. So they're in trouble. They're going to need supplies from England to keep them going. And that was actually the plan. Every few months, a new ship would show up with more people, more supplies, and keep this going. In the meantime, they'd start growing their own food. They'd look for gold. And if they found gold, they'd send it back. They'd pay for more supplies and more people. And that's how it was supposed to work. But this war happens in 1588, just a few months after this colony is established. Suddenly, every English ship is needed to defend England from this giant Spanish fleet called the Spanish Armada. Even though the English are able to defeat the Spanish in 1588, they're so worried that Spain may come and launch a second attack the next year that they still won't allow any of their ships to go anywhere but right home at England to defend it. It takes 2 years before Raleigh and his investors can send more supplies and more people to their colony. And when they get there, they find nothing. All those people, that 110 or so people, they've just disappeared. The island looks like it has never been inhabited at all. Now, it has become one of the great historical mysteries as to what's happened there. Most historians at this point kind of lean towards the theory that a hurricane came along, the same hurricane that's actually going to hit the Spanish fleet and sink most of it after the battle with the English, that it probably went right over this island and just wiped it clean. Whatever English settlers were able to survive after not getting any food, after having their homes wiped out, probably had to go live with the natives, although the natives said pretty much they were gone. So more than likely a hurricane came in and just wiped the whole settlement out and killed everybody. But one thing we do have to say is not a great start for the English, right? Their first attempt is a disaster. Raleigh and his investors are broke. Raleigh's actually going to go to prison in the Tower of London for a while because he can't pay his debts. And because he's close to the Queen, it's seen as kind of a dishonoring the Queen. He's going to be put to death because of this. So this is a bit of a disaster all the way around. The English don't look good here. Their first attempt is an unmitigated failure. And it kind of explains why it takes about another 20 years for somebody to say, let's try it again. But they do, because it is working for other groups of people. So once again, in the early 1600s, when a new monarch is on the throne of England, this one is James I. He's originally Scottish, but he's king of both Scotland and England. Once again, a group of investors comes to the English king and says, look, we would like to establish a colony in the New World. We think there's gold there. We think we can make money. And regardless, you get a base of operations where English ships can operate out of. But James kind of points out, well, the last time we tried this, it didn't work well. Well, the Virginia Company, as it's called, this group of investors, says, look, the first time they tried this, they were kind of silly. They sent men, women, and children, farmers. We're going to send adventurers, noblemen, people that know how to take care of themselves, people that are interested in getting rich, that are motivated to go find that gold and silver. That's what we're going to do. So after a few weeks of pleading and convincing, once again, the investors win the day. They're able to convince the king that because there's no real investment needed on his part, that he's going to get a share of any of the gold and silver they find. And in the end, he gets the use of a colony, that there's really nothing for him to lose. So in 1607, they put together this expedition. They put out an advertising campaign to tell former soldiers and adventurers and explorers to come and join their operation, that you're going to be an employee for this Virginia company. They're going to put you to work and you're going to get a share of the money that they find. But in the end, this is the Virginia company's colony. They're going to control and run it, and they're going to run it for their king. And this works. It gets a lot of people to join on. Within a few months, they've got about 100 men, adventurers, younger sons of nobles who aren't going to inherit anything from their families, to come and make their fortunes, if you will, right? That's really what this is. It's an adventure. It's an opportunity at making yourself rich. You know, it's this idea of get rich or die trying. So in May of 1607, the 3 English ships with these 100 men and their supplies lands off the coast of the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States, essentially today's Virginia. And they sail up one of the rivers there. They name the river after their king, James, and they call it the James River. And then they sail up that river till they really can't sail any much farther, and they decide here's where we'll establish our colony. In the lower right-hand corner here is a picture of that area that'll become known as Jamestown, about in the early 1900s. So what you see here is that territory is actually reverted back to its natural state. Essentially, these guys have established themselves in a swamp, right? The water moves really slowly. There's not a lot of fresh water in the area. It's very overgrown with kind of scraggly trees and bushes. It's not what you would call a great real estate. To make matters a little bit more challenging, none of these guys that are here in this expedition actually know how to farm or turn trees into buildings and that kind of stuff. They can do some rudimentary work, but there's nobody that's a professional lumberjack. There's nobody that's a professional woodworker that can make those trees into boards and walls and building materials, right? They're going to have to do that kind of an ad hoc basis. Another big challenge, besides the topography and the lack of skills that this group has, is that they're going to end up landing in the middle of one of the most powerful Native American tribes in that region, a group called the Powhatan tribe, named after their leader, Chief Powhatan, who's put together about 25, 30 individual tribes under his control. He has about 25,000 people under his control. And these guys, these English settlers, have just landed in the middle of this Native American empire. But that's okay for the English because they don't care about all that. They just want to find the gold that they think is in this river. That is their first goal. What they find out, however, is this is going to be a bit of a disaster, just like the first one. What we kind of see here on this map on the right-hand side of our screen is the fact that there are a whole lot of natives surrounding this place called Jamestown, which is right here in the middle of our map. That's where the English decided to land. Now, the natives don't live in large numbers along this area because the region is just so poor for cultivating food and for game, right? They use it part of the year, but for most of the time they kind of don't live there because there's not a lot of resources for them. But they still control it. It's still theirs. But what's going to happen is, because they're in such poor land conditions, because the English don't have enough supplies to really keep them going, this plan is sort of like what the Roanoke plan was. We're going to drop these 100 guys off and their supplies. We're going to go back, get some more people, some more supplies, and just keep sending them over until this thing sticks, until it builds up. On the surface, makes perfect sense. Problem is, these first 100 guys are going to find out it is very difficult to survive here. One of those early colonists, one of those first 100 settlers to Jamestown, wrote back to his friends in England, what we drank each day was cold water taken out of the river, which at tide was very salty. So what that means is, if you notice here in this map, Jamestown is on this thing called the James River. But in this region, it's not really a river, it's actually an estuary, right? Which means this is mostly ocean. The river's actually way back here. So when the tide comes in, most of this water all the way up to here is mostly salt water. At low tide, when the ocean goes out, most of that is mud with some fresh water flowing through it. And what ended up happening is these guys, in a world before indoor plumbing and sewage treatment plants, are dumping their human waste in that estuary. And when the tide goes out, whatever water is there is mixing with that human waste, and they're killing themselves. They're drinking bad water all the time because that's all they have available to them, and they're getting sick. One English critic of all of this that said this is a stupid idea and we shouldn't be doing it, said instead of a plantation, and plantation is just a English name for colony back then, or a term Europeans used for colonization. This critic said, Virginia will shortly get the name of a slaughterhouse. What's going to happen in this place? Most of those people are going to die. And that is actually true. Out of those first 100 settlers, about 66, somewhere around 70% of them died within their first 3 months. The ones that didn't die, that 30 or 40 that didn't die, they all got sick. They were just lucky enough to survive that illness. So it is amazing what's happening here, right? So next we have to kind of ask ourselves, how did they survive? Now, there's a popular legend to all of this, and as part of one of our assignments in this class is to look at a Disney film called Pocahontas and look at a short clip of it and try kind of look at the romanticized version of all this. Here, however, is the reality. So what you might want to do right now is stop the lecture, go to our online sources for chapter 2, the online reader, look at that film clip from Pocahontas, the Disney film, watch it, and then come back to this, okay? All right. You should have had a chance to watch that video already, and now we'll kind of talk about the reality. John Smith is one of these first 100 or so settlers that shows up in Jamestown. Originally, he was scheduled to be part of the leadership committee, but he got sick almost immediately when he showed up. So he's been incapacitated for the first 6 months or so this colony is existing. But once he recovers and gets healthy, he realizes this colony is in a lot of trouble. He basically does take command. What's interesting, what I'm telling you here, is who's not involved in all of this. That's right, Pocahontas, right? She doesn't have anything to do with this. She's a 12-year-old child right now. So he does know her, he knows who she is, but she's not of any real consequence to him. He has more important things to worry about, right? And after all, if you look at this picture, he is not the young, rugged, good-looking man that they depict in the Disney film. He's a short, furry, red-headed guy that is probably in his late 30s, early 40s at this point. And he's already lived kind of a hard, rough and tumble, adventurous life. And that's kind of who he is. He's an adventurer. He takes chances. He's a self-promoter is what we would call him. In some ways, he's an action hero. And he becomes kind of America's first success story before there's even an America. So this John Smith, former soldier, starts trying to get this colony on its feet so it doesn't collapse and everybody dies. He tells them to quit looking for gold. They're not finding any. They need to start finding food and places to get it. What they actually find out is the ones that have the most food are the natives. They're the ones to trade with. So here in John Smith's first days, as these settlers keep dying, even when another round of supplies shows up and settlers, they have the same problems. They use up those supplies from England incredibly quickly. The new people that have been sent over, about another 100 settlers, they die at about the same rate as the original 100. So out of the first 220, there's only about 70 people left after the first 9 or 12 months of this colony. So who do they look to for help? It's actually the natives in the area. Who knows how to survive there? Who has the good land and has access to resources that these English need? The natives. So they start turning to the natives. John Smith starts trying to work out deals with Chief Powhatan. The legend is that he basically John Smith will tell the story from his point of view that the natives were so in awe of him that they thought of him as a god. In reality, however, the natives wanted to get something out of this too, right? The English are desperate for food, but what do the English have that the natives might want? Well, think about it. What if the Aztecs had had a group of Europeans to trade with as their conquered tribes turned against them, or the Spanish started marching on them? What would have really helped the Aztecs there? Metal weapons, guns, all that kind of stuff. So for Powhatan, he looks at this group of 70 men or so, and he doesn't see a threat. He sees an opportunity. After all, he and his tribes could wipe these guys out anytime they want, or they could just do nothing and they'll die on their own. But in the meantime, he can get something. He'll feed them, they'll stay, they're trapped within his territory, and he can get the weapons he needs to use on his neighboring tribes that he sees as the real threat. So when you get down to it, it was kind of a symbiotic relationship, right? Neither side particularly loves the other. The story of John Smith and Pocahontas falling in love never actually happens. This is a commercial relationship. Both sides are getting something out of these transactions. The English get the food they desperately need, and the natives get some weapons. And this actually works as long as John Smith is there. He works out deals and trades sort of fairly with the natives. But eventually, people get tired of John Smith telling them what to do. They turn on him, they injure him, and he goes back home to England, where he promotes himself and explains to everybody how awesome he is and how great a job he did. And he becomes a celebrity in England. But in the meantime, this colony has problems. Without John Smith to kind of be the go-between the natives, they find that the natives are less likely to give them things because the English don't want to trade anymore. They just want to take food from the natives. In the end, a war starts popping up between the two sides. The natives and the English are fighting each other. The English, things are getting so bad for them in their little colony of Jamestown that they're actually resorting to the fact of cannibalism to stay alive in some cases. They're just running out of everything. And that's where the next part comes in, right? We'll explain what saves this colony, what keeps it going, what allows this one to take when the previous English attempt at a colonization at Roanoke failed so utterly. So a couple things to kind of keep in mind here. First of all, the Spanish show that it's what's possible, that you can build a huge empire that can totally change your fortunes. And they show that with the advantages of disease, advantages of technology and animals that Native Americans don't have, if you're willing to be violent, you can take over almost anything you want. You just have to have enough numbers and at least get some Native allies on your side if you don't have the numbers. Other Europeans are going to follow, sometimes following the Spanish model, sometimes finding their own way based on what works best for them. In the end, however, they're all basically looking for the same thing. All of these Europeans are looking for land to control, to increase their wealth. They're specifically looking for things like gold and silver and precious gems. Sometimes they find them, most of the times they don't. But what is also starting to show up here is these colonies are a place for some of these European citizens to find opportunities. For John Smith, this was a life-changing event. He went here, lived for a year and a half in this English colony, and suddenly he's a celebrity. He dies a rich man, famous person in England in the 1630s. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of push for Europeans to come over here and keep these empires going. For one side, however, this is just an unmitigated disaster. For Native peoples, this is going to work out horribly every single time. Even in a place like New France, where the French are actually trying to work with the natives, the French are inadvertently going to bring diseases that just devastate their neighbors, devastate their allies, and everybody else in the area. And the English are doing it, and the Spanish are doing it, and the Dutch are doing it, and the Swedes, and everybody else that's involved. Heck, even when enslaved Africans are brought over, they're bringing the same diseases and spreading them as well. So in the end, for natives, you're not only dying from diseases, but then you're slowly but surely being pushed out of your home territories. Maybe the most devastating example of all this is what happens to like the Arawak and other Caribbean tribes. They are literally wiped out. They just don't exist anymore. There are very few genetic remnants of them in the populations that live in the Caribbean today. The people in the Caribbean today are all descended from Europeans or Africans. There's really no Native Americans. But when Columbus showed up, there were probably several 100,000 Native Americans just living in Cuba and Hispaniola, just two islands. And now they're all wiped out. So this process is going to play out on a huge scale across the entire continent. And the same basic refrain is going to happen over and over again. Europeans are going to come in, natives are going to get sick. That weakens them, makes it possible for Europeans to keep pushing and pushing and pushing natives off their own lands. All right, that's where we're going to leave it for this lecture. Look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you.